memories because we just didn't need to remember them anymore. All that stuff is still there, tucked away in our minds. It's just that it's been pushed back to make room for all the other stuff that's cluttering our brains. But there are some things that I am sure we will always know, not just because they were memorized, but because they are truly memorable and meaningful parts of our lives that we know by heart. In a few weeks, my son Chris will be celebrating a birthday. I remember every detail of the day he was born, and I have his newborn face memorized by heart. I see it every time I see him. That's often how it is with parents and children, or grandparents and grandchildren. We will always have our loved ones with us by heart. And those memories that are written on our hearts are the ones that will always be with us. Now, the passage that Bob read to us from Jeremiah was spoken to the people of Judah. The words were meant to remind everyone that they should remember God and God's promise made to them by heart. Unfortunately, that's not what the people were remembering. They had forgotten a lot of those things that we've been talking about during these weeks of Lent. People had forgotten how God had promised to never again destroy the earth by flood. They had forgotten the covenant God made with their ancestors, Abraham and Sarah. These folks could no longer remember the old story of slavery in Egypt and God's promise to free them and bring them to a place of safety. They didn't even bother trying to remember the commandments they had to memorize as children. And they had no clue about the story of the snake on a stick that had saved so many of their ancestors' lives. Indeed, all those promises of God that had been memorized over the years were erased by a whole lot of other stuff. Stuff like worshiping the idol gods of Baal. It turned out that idol worship was a whole lot easier because those idol gods didn't make any demands on people. Idol worship made injustice and corruption okay. People who had the power and control took advantage of the less fortunate, and no one held them accountable. Certainly, gods made of stone and metal didn't care about living life according to the rules Moses received from God. Life was great when no one really cared about how God wanted the community to live. Every person for himself or herself was going along just fine, thank you very much. Ignoring God's promises for living in right relationship with each other was okay as far as the people of God were concerned. Then along came the prophet Jeremiah, who demanded that people get themselves turned around before it was too late. Jeremiah knew that bad things were about to happen to the Israelites, and he did his very best to warn everyone. Unfortunately, Jeremiah, who went around wailing and smashing pots all over the place, often found himself in jail. You see, Jeremiah was a threat to the good life everyone was enjoying, and no one wanted to hear the bad news of death and destruction that Jeremiah was shouting about. All those warnings were just a whole lot of needless noise as far as most people were concerned. The disaster was about to strike the people of Judah. Now, the people of the northern part of Israel had already been overrun by the Assyrians, and now for the Judean people of the south, the Babylonians were within striking distance. Just as Jeremiah had predicted, the people of Judah were hauled off into exile in Babylon. Yet in this moment of disaster, instead of Jeremiah declaring, "I told you so," Jeremiah speaks words of comfort and assurance. Jeremiah knows that the ancient matter how many times we choose to be unfaithful or decide to worship other gods, no matter how many times we forget God, God will still remember us. And that's not all. God promised the people of Judah something else as well. God also promised to wipe the slate clean and start all over. Over and over again, that's what God said through the prophet Jeremiah. No matter how many times we turn our back on God, no matter how many times we forget what God has written on our hearts, God will start all over with us. That's what Jesus was talking about that day that Philip and Andrew announced that some folks had come to see him. Walk into a bookstore and find the religion section. You should see an array of Bibles and devotional books along with biblical commentaries. After you've browsed through that section, look to your left or right, and I'll bet you'll find yourself in the spirituality section. There you'll find books with titles something like The Journal, The Journey to Wholeness, Essential Spirituality, or even one with a title something like How to Make Your Dreams Come True. One writer puts it this way: we are on a human quest, a search for fulfillment. We are looking for quick answers to the mysteries of life, such as why do bad things happen to good people? Where will I find peace and happiness? How can I make sense out of a seemingly senseless world? Well, guess what? We aren't the first people who are searching for a quick fix that will make our dreams come true. According to our gospel story this morning, some Greeks were looking for Jesus. Perhaps they were on a quest of their own. These Greeks, or Gentiles, had come to Jerusalem for Passover. Now, we really don't know exactly what they said to Philip, but it might have gone something like this. We want to see Jesus. You know, the guy who turned water into wine, who made the blind man see and the lame man pick up his mat and walk. We've heard this guy, Jesus, fed thousands of people with just 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. You know, the same fellow who walked on water and brought the man Lazarus back to life. We know that if we can just see him, our questions will be answered. We'll finally have a quick fix for all of our problems, and our dreams will come true. So what do you think? Will you introduce us to Jesus? Unfortunately, the Jesus they met didn't quite measure up to their idea of Mr. Fix-It. By the time today's gospel story rolls around, Jesus understood that his time on earth was just about out, and that he would soon be lifted up on the cross to die. Somehow, Jesus knew he had to find a way to get through to those of us who are determined to have our dreams come true. That's why he told this story about a grain of wheat and how, if it isn't buried in the ground, it shrivels up and dies. Here's what I think Jesus wanted us to learn. We are expected to respond to God's forgiving love. You know how it goes. Seeds need to be planted in the ground. They need to be buried and nourished, watered and tended to in order for the roots to grow. Seeds are just seeds until they are planted and looked after. Our lives will never take root or sprout or grow unless we're willing to be transformed by God's love. And it's a transformation that's written on our hearts, just as Jeremiah told the ancient people of Judah. The transformation grows from inside us and sprouts up and out as we live in the light of God. Yet all this amazing transformation requires a risk on our part. Sadly, many of us may decide the risk isn't worth the effort, and so we choose to lie around at the top of the ground. We choose to keep our lives comfortable and secure, just the way they are. Jesus reminds us that when we choose to do that, we will shrivel up and wither away. Barbara Brown Taylor says it this way: what Jesus was trying to tell us is that if we do everything in our power to protect our lives the way they are, if we successfully prevent change, prevent conflict, prevent pain, then at the end we'll find that we had no life at all. But we could choose to hate all the things that cheapen our lives by chasing comfort, safety, and superiority in the world. We can choose to get rid of all those things that keep us lying around on the top of the ground without being planted. In other words, if we dare to risk everything and plant ourselves in God's redeeming love, there will be no end to the abundance of our lives. Jesus showed us that himself. He could have chosen the way of self-protection. Jesus could have stopped walking around in the open and gone underground, sleeping in a different hideout every night. He could have toned down his message, made it more appealing to the church leaders and those in control. He could have shown more respect for the established church and its burdensome rules. Jesus could have stopped eating with the outcasts and marginalized people. Jesus could have done all those things and been safe and secure if he loved his life just the way it was and chose to preserve it. He could have done it. But we know that if he did all that, he would be just like a little grain of wheat lying around on the top of the ground. He'd wither up and disappear, die, without having lived life to its fullest. Yet we know that's not what Jesus chose to do. Instead, he just kept at it. He continued to challenge the authorities, the powerful people who practiced the letter of the law, but forgot the message. We've talked before about the people Jesus dealt with, who wore masks of self-righteousness and self-indulgence. Jesus walked around in the open, tearing away those masks, and in the end, he suffered for that choice. The suffering of Jesus was the fulfillment of God's will for us. Jesus knew that unless he died and was buried, there would be no life for us. In order for a seed to do what it is meant to do, it must be given up to the earth. And in that giving up, the seed is transformed. We can dig and dig around in the ground looking for that seed and never find it. It gave up its life so there could be more wheat in the world. If Jesus had chosen to save his life, to write a few books and go on a speaking tour that promised everyone's dreams would come true, his movement may have lasted for 100 years. But that's not what he chose. Because Jesus was willing to lose his life because he chose to show us what life means instead of just telling us. Because of all that, we have been fed by the wheat Jesus planted for us. Jesus chose to show us what giving up comfortable and secure lives really means. He chose to show us that by taking the risk of living with God's love on our hearts, we too can be transformed into what God expects us to be. God's promise to us that is written on our hearts is one that will change us from the inside out if we choose to risk it all and follow Christ. This week, go out and plant some seeds. And remember that God's forgiving and transforming love is as close as every beat of your heart. Amen. As we enter into our time of prayer this morning, are there joys to be shared? I have been given a joy to share with all of you. Lindsay and Corey Mills, you know who they are pregnant with their second child. Yes. Hallelujah. Congratulations, Auntie and Grandma. Are there other joys? The sun is shining, it's nice and warm, right?
Yes.
I was walking in this woods yesterday. The crocuses are really blooming, and the daffodils have begun to bloom down there. I don't know. Have they started to bloom here?
No.
We'll just wait. And the tulips are beginning to come up as well. I think sometimes Columbus is a little bit farther ahead. Along with joys, we often have concerns, and there are concerns to be shared this morning. Continue to ask that we keep in prayer all of those who are still suffering from COVID-19, who are struggling with unemployment and all of those concerns that people have these days. Let us remember all of them in our prayers. And so let us pray. All knowing and remembering God, we lift our hearts to you in thanksgiving for your wondrous acts. We are mindful of your steadfast love in spite of all of those times we have forgotten you and your promises to us. We praise you